Welcome everyone to this special online panel discussion, Japanese Textile, New Perspective. My name is Yukie Kamiya, Gallery Director of Japan Society. In conjunction with the exhibition at Japan Society, Boro Textile, Sustainable Aesthetic, which started in March. This panel discussion is co-organized by JASA, Japanese Society of America, and Japan Society, two organizations that share the love and passion to Japanese art and culture. Today, we are so privileged to have three specialists of Japanese and Asian textile. Dr. Monica Vingsek, Thomas Murray, Elizabeth Wilson. Before starting the discussion, I'd like to introduce briefly the background of the exhibition. The exhibition Boro Textile examined the Japanese handicraft Boro by ordinary anonymous people and explore ethics and aesthetics of sustainability in a tradition by limited resources, which is one of the most critical subjects in society today. In this exhibition, we introduce Boro especially from Tohoku, northern part of Japan, where people patched and mended the textile generation by generation over 100 years. But not only, the exhibition aimed to trace Boro's continued legacy within contemporary creative practice. As the exhibition designer, we invited Soil, New York-based architecture firm, and they illuminated the beauty of survival. The imperfection of Boro is a creative feature that pioneer of avant-garde fashion design has been inspired. From them, we exhibit Rei Kawakubo, Issei Miyake, and Yoji Yamamoto, who had the sensational debut questioning the conventional notion of beauty. The impact of Japanese textile has also been taken over to the US-based artists, such as Susan Gianchiolo, Christina Kim in contemporary generation, with the idea of non-waste. During this health crisis, Japan Society has shifted our major platform to virtual, but we try to keep continuing connecting artists and audiences. I'd like to express special thanks to JASA to collaborate with us and makes this opportunity happen. Now, I want to introduce JASA President. Please join me welcoming Mr. Wilson Graybill.
Thank you, Yukie-san. And first, let me express my deep appreciation to you and the Japan Society for your wonderful efforts in co-organizing this event. The Japanese Art Society of America has partnered with Japan Society for the past several years to bring Japanese art programming to our members and the larger public. And we all have benefited greatly from this collaboration. Before I introduce our panel, I want to say a few words about JASA. We were founded in 1973 as a group of dedicated print enthusiasts. And since then, we've grown to be the oldest and largest organization in North America dedicated exclusively to the study and appreciation of Japanese art broadly. Our members are collectors, students, academics, museum professionals, dealers, and anyone else who appreciates and wants to know more about the arts of Japan. In addition to lecture programs like this one, our first on Zoom, we organize museum trips and special visits to private collections, which we hope to resume shortly. We also publish Impressions, our award-winning journal dedicated to the arts and culture of Japan. If you're not already a member of JASA, please join us. Now to our illustrious presenters, all of them, I'm proud to say, members and supporters of JASA. Our moderator today is Dr. Monica Vingsek, the Diane and Arthur Abbey Associate Curator for Japanese Decorative Arts at the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York. A distinguished art historian specializing in Japanese decorative arts and textiles, Monica has curated, co-curated, and published extensively in the field, including acclaimed exhibitions on the tale of Genji, Japanese bamboo art, and Kimono, A Modern History. Thomas Murray is a highly experienced independent researcher, collector, lecturer, and private dealer of Asian and tribal art, with more than 50 publications to his name. His recent book, Textiles of Japan, was met with critical acclaim, and I should add that it's as beautifully illustrated as it is written, a truly gorgeous book that should be in every serious textile collector's library. Tom is past president of the Antique Tribal Art Dealers Association and served a 3-year term as a member of President Obama's Cultural Property Advisory Committee at the State Department. Elizabeth Wilson is an art historian who studied Chinese art history with the legendary James Cahill at the University of California at Berkeley. After various teaching positions in the field, including Denver University, she founded Asiatica, an Asian art and antique dealership in Kansas City in 1976. All her academic and visual training has been brought to bear there for the past 44 years. Thank you all, panel, for participating in this highly anticipated event. And now I'd like to turn over the floor to Monica. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everybody. It is my great pleasure to join you all today and would like to thank the organizers, Japanese Art Society of America and Japan Society for the kind invitation. I'm going to share my screen. In my short introductory remarks, I would like to present a framework for this program and introduce some of the subjects we will discuss with the panelists. The precious 8th century textile collection housed in the Shosoin treasure house of the Todaiji Temple in Nara consists of approximately 200,000 individual pieces, counting each tiny fragment. Amazingly, most of the pieces are in relatively good condition, and many of them preserved their brilliant colors. There are not only Buddhist banners, monks' robes, bugaku costumes, but also cords for mirrors, linings for boxes, and many tiny scraps and fragments. The conservation, restoration of the Shosoin textiles started in the late 19th century and still an ongoing process. Even the tiniest fragments were mounted for preservation. Most of the Shosoin textiles were used in Buddhist rituals and ceremonies. This also relates to the kesa, the outer garments worn by Buddhist monks. Traditionally, these garments were pieced together as a patchwork from scraps of fabrics salvaged from used clothing, often donated by members of the community. It reflects the historical Buddha's renunciation of wealth. The Japanese term boro refers to the state of objects that have been used, torn, or worn to tatters, then extensively repaired and often used far beyond their normal expected life cycle. These humble clothes, mats, bed covers are witnesses of stories lived by the common people, farmers, fishermen, living in rural areas along the Sea of Japan, the northeast of Honshu Island, including Aomori Prefecture. To the contemporary viewers, many boro convey strong emotional power, mainly because the artful patches and reinforcements carry the imprint of ancestral hands and traces of history. They signify the unspoken relationships among the family members who worked on them and used them. Boro also relates to the theme of repair and reuse and invites the audience to reassess the concept of value, the meaning of mending, and recycling in our current consumer culture. The boro textiles presented in the Japan Society's exhibition are from the collection of Tanaka Chuzaboro, a cultural anthropologist who walked the farming and fishing villages of Aomori Prefecture from the mid-1960s, searching for traces of local traditions, material culture, stories of the elderly, and all kinds of artifacts. He collected more than 30,000 items, some of which were designated an important cultural property. The film director, Kurosawa Akira, used Tanaka's garments in his movie Dreams in 1990. We will discuss this further with Tom Murray in our panel discussion. To the makers of boro, especially in Aomori Prefecture, the relatively warm cotton fabric was very precious as they had limited access to it. It was too cold on the north to grow cotton. To create reinforced clothing, they stitched layer to layer and stuffed hemp fuzz between those. During the freezing cold winters, they needed as much insulation as possible. Cotton was brought to Japan from China and became established by the 18th century in the warmer regions of Japan. However, in the cold areas of the country, the only available fibers were local hemp, rami, mulberry, wisteria. These best fibers were strong but not warm against the body and very laborious to produce. During the long winters, when there was no work on the fields, women had time to painstakingly make yarns from plant fibers and weave cloth for the family. A respect for and ingenious use of scarce materials led to the emergence of regional folk textile traditions such as sakiori. Torn strips of castaway cotton cloth were woven with best fiber warp into a thick material. Another form of folk textile tradition is sashiko, which derives from stitching or quilting precious cotton yarns into locally available best fiber cloth. Even paper was used. Pages from old books made of mulberry were shredded into fine strands, which were twisted and used as weft yarns for workwear. A few important underlying aesthetics that unite all boro textiles can be attributed to the fact that most Japanese traditional textiles are woven in a unit of one bolt, which measures about 14 inches by 12 yards. The bolt is cut into a series of rectangular panels, which are then sewn together to create a kimono. We will talk about this with Elizabeth later in the discussion. This structure makes it possible for worn clothing to be easily taken apart and transformed into coverlets and mattresses. The rectangular nature of the original cloth is reflected in the geometric patterns of the patches and reinforcements. In addition, the clothing used by farmers was typically dyed with indigo. That's why we see predominantly blue fabrics. Some of these small pieces were saved and collected in a household over generations of family members. Most of them were recycled from cotton, clothing, and rags. A thriving rag trade emerged with the establishment of the Kitamaebune, a commercial shipping route for transporting products to and from northern Japan. Used silk kimono were transported from Kyoto, the capital, to Edo, and castaway cotton clothing brought from Edo to Osaka to be dispersed to other parts of Japan. Nothing was wasted. The Japanese word mottainai, meaning too good to waste, has been the go-to admonishment for waste in Japan for centuries, rooted in Buddhist culture. Today, it forces people to look beyond our throwaway culture and add respect to the well-known concept of reduce, reuse, recycle. The United Nations estimates that a single pair of jeans requires more than 2 pounds of cotton. As it tends to be grown in dry environments, producing this amount requires about 1,800 gallons of water. Furthermore, around 70 million barrels of oil a year are used to make polyester fibers for our clothes. Deconstruction in the world of contemporary fashion, especially as seen in the work of Rei Kawakubo for Comme des Garçons, Dries Van Noten, Yoji Yamamoto, Martin Margiela, amongst others, often described as unfinished, destroyed, or recycled. Some of these garments appear to indicate the decay of the material. It is also challenging the old hierarchies of dividing designer compositions from everyday clothes and merges the world of runways with the street. Garments that appeared from the 1990s with images of decay and poverty appeared to question and mock fashion in its privileged position, but also reflected the spirit of the times and reacted to social stress and degradation brought by economic recession. The aesthetic of recyclability and reuse speaks to the notion of preserving resources and reducing waste. Especially, Margiela's compositions suggest that recovered garments and fabrics can have a second life. Look at those socks on the front. Comme des Garçons' lace sweater, where lace refers to the gaping holes, recalls images of decomposition and can suggest the need for sustainable and long-lasting materials. On the other side of the fashion industry spectrum, Muji was a pioneer in Japan in encouraging customers to purchase less than perfect products. Muji has also been a long-time participant of the Fuku Fuku project, a nationwide effort by retailers in Japan, inviting customers to drop off their unwanted clothes for recycling. For Japanese textile designer Reiko Sudo, founder of Nuno, recycling is not just about environmental and social consciousness, but an artistic philosophy. Sudo is renowned throughout Japan for pushing the boundaries of traditional textiles and believes there is no such thing as scrap. She stated, "Everything is useful as long as we do not waste our imagination." With this, I close my remarks and invite Tom Murray to give his presentation on repurposed cloth, the Boro textile tradition in Japan. Thank you for your attention.
Hello. I would like to thank you for inviting me. It's a great honor, and I have tremendous respect and love for Japan, first of all, the artists that made the textiles that we're going to be speaking about. In some cases, we're speaking about an art form that is either arising from the subconscious or conscious. That's going to be the underlying theme. I want to cover these topics. And I start with the nature of my invitation, which I greatly appreciate. Both Japan Society and JASA have invited me in part thanks to this book, which brought my secret passion of collecting Japanese textiles out to the public, as I'm better known in some quarters for my Indonesian commitment. There's also island societies off the coast, and I was naturally very attracted to Japanese aesthetics when I had the opportunity to live there in 1983. This book, Textiles of Japan, is a magnum opus of my work, but I greatly wish to pay my respects to my contributing authors, as well as the photographers, editors, and publishers from Holly Magazine in particular. I also very much would like to thank and acknowledge the Minneapolis Institute of Art for the acquisition of my collection following the book, which was a delightful and very important surprise. Andreas Marx, the curator, as I have to say, a genius for his recognition and advocate for acquiring the collection, and everybody is invited to come see this exhibition when it opens, and it's postponed a year and the exact date is not dialed in, but I hope that we'll all meet there. I've been invited to ask, well, what inspired me to collect and to go to Asia in the first place? Well, my mother's brother, and indeed her uncle, were famous sailors. They sailed around the world. In my uncle's case, Captain Fenton Kilkenny sailed on the Yankee, which is a great old clipper ship. He also was a crew member of on the Fairchild expedition to collect botanical specimens in the Philippines, in Indonesia, Borneo, and I grew up with stories. The idea to go there and to wear a sarong, and indeed, I came in. I came in 1978 and began my search for the meaning of life, and still working on that. But I was encouraged and indeed arrived in Japan in 1982. I'm afraid I only have one slide of my time there. This was my very dear friend and girlfriend of the time, Terumi Inoue, who helped me enter into the Japanese society and mentality and philosophy in a way that I could have never done as a gaijin coming out of Borneo, and I thank her and acknowledge her now. But aside from the experience of total immersion of being in Japan for that 82, 83 period, I was reading voraciously, and the book, The Unknown Craftsman, was particularly inspiring. It was a transliteration from the Japanese by Bernard Leach of Syoto Yanagi-san's work. And in it, I was able to find the meaning of why I was attracted to certain objects, including baskets. They were very simple, in some cases modest in their intent, and yet very pure. And as Professor Yanagi gave voice to the idea that these ordinary objects, as handcrafted, had a spiritual content, almost a Buddha nature could be found. And this aligned with the values that were also being considered in England and the arts and crafts movement. So there was a kind of universal recognition that the industrial age was likely to usurp these handcrafted traditions, and that we should find beauty and meaning in them. There were books that inspired my travels and focus on textiles. Jacqueline Orr Larson's The Dyer's Art was already considered a Bible when I started traveling in Asia. And in there I was seeing Okinawan textiles, Japanese pieces of resist. And I had those aesthetics and ideas in my mind when I started to travel. When I was in Japan, on my many return visits, I had the privilege and pleasure of seeing an exhibition at the Suntory Museum called Japanese Folk Textiles, an American Collection. And it was such a modest name, and the pieces were so fabulous. And I thought, wow, you know, I could do this, but I can never equal this, but I could at least try to understand what it was that the collector had in mind. And I came to find out that Fifi White was the collector, who was Elizabeth Wilson's partner, whom we're going to be hearing from after I finish my little talk. So this book was very inspiring, and one of the topics that I especially loved from the very beginning were the Ainu robes of the far north, costumes that range different styles and types. And this book by Okamura-san turns out to, in English, be part of a marvelous series that was able to find meaning of my own taste. And also I visited museums, let's say, like Serizawa-san's great textile artist museum, and his interest in pieces of Ainu and salmon skin textiles and costumes. But we're here to speak about Boro. Boro textiles were not exactly the pieces of a type defined or described as minge, and yet I've internalized the values of what I thought the direction of the arrow of Mingei was about, and this would include Boro very much. And I was responding especially as an aesthetic object. So choices I made for my collection ended up being in the book. I'm going to show you some pieces of that selection and some very simple means of organizing response to this aesthetic. So there are two primary forms. One would be a costume piece, and the other would be a flat textile, as seen here. This, we see in this case the two Boro types being formal and eccentric. There are beauty in both. So the discipline of placement of these squares, as Monica already offered in such a worthy and interesting introduction, is a part of the fascination with the material, the variation in indigo. And yet this other more wild type, eccentric, is very attractive to me, this notion of different types of cloth that join together. So we see two different variations we might refer to as the order and chaos. Form and function is really important theme because these are useful objects. They were made to be used, and in this sense they follow the Mingei idea. And on a practical basis, a patch will go where a hole is. So this layering effect is maybe understood to be practical, and yet the actual buildup becomes a part of a certain beauty. Now, the Wabi-Sabi aesthetic is, I need not introduce that concept to people who are listening, as but it's a deeply held principle in my own taste. And I also want to mention the art of impermanence. So that happened to be at the Asia Society at the same time as the Japan Society exhibition. So I was thrilled that I could see both as a visitor from California. So the art of impermanence and this idea that this layering, this history, which we will arrive at a greater discussion in the latter part of this talk about the Bodo and the nature of Bodo, but I'd like to draw your attention to the idea of the art of detail. So if we see the whole piece, or looking at that, we probe deeper, we see greater beauty as we get closer and closer. And indeed, for those of you who have a little hobby as I do about physics, the interesting idea of fractals, and that the deeper you go and the design elements just start opening up again and again, more and more. So who created these? What was the nature of their psyche, creative process? Unfortunately, we do not have available in general pictures of a Boro artist, but in this case, I've elected to use this photograph of the woman who would be the unknown artist, and her process of placing patches as a conscious or subconscious. In either case, it's coming out of a wellspring of experience and cultural context and beautiful environment that could have agricultural references as well. So the aesthetic affinities, and people sometimes have a sense of wonder that such textiles have, in some cases, become very valuable in the world market of art because these shared affinities with contemporary art or mid-century art, which I like to draw your attention to, is this layering of indigo colors and show some relation to some artists who were very consciously trying to arrive at some of the same aesthetic discoveries found by Boro artists on their own. So here is the irascibles, the 15 artists in the New York school, and include some very famous artists, like Clifford Still and William de Kooning, Motherwell, Jackson Pollock, and unfortunately only one woman artist. So, you know, it is interesting that the differentiation of women making, I believe, all the Boros, and yet men making all the paintings. But it's nice to look at these paintings and consider how blue, in this case, can draw us in, and what effect this has on the conscious and subconscious of our own as viewers. I shift now to resources. I've been encouraged to, I've been encouraged to introduce the sources of where you can find, if you go to Japan, Boro, and I highly recommend Tadashi Morita. Morita-san and his wife have had a gallery since long before I arrived in Japan in '82. He was the first friend from, and he was an advisor on my book, and I love this man. He's great and wise, and speaks perfect English, by the way. So he's in the Aoyama district, and a very nice place to walk around in its own right. Kyoto is, of course, a great place, a must for everybody, and a place I've continuously revisited over the last 35 plus years. And Kei Kawasaki-san, she is just a fantastic person, and she's passionate about fiber arts, textiles, and she is just a tireless advocate, and please do visit her shop and gallery, and you'll see many Boro featured there. And in the area, there are also other textile dealers that. So with that, I'd just like to say thank you, arigato, and my respects to all who helped make this program possible, and my appreciation for my co-panelists, Monica and Elizabeth. Thank you very much, Wilson, for your introduction, and I will close on that. I want to introduce now Elizabeth Wilson, who is both a friend and a colleague, a respected scholar in her own right, and a creator of beautiful clothing. I confess that fashion has never been my top specialty, but I'm working on that. Please, Elizabeth, and thank you, Yuki.
Hello, I'm trying to play you this. I'm Elizabeth Wilson, and I'm addicted to kimono. I come to the subject from a completely different perspective, namely the fine art end of it. I was trained as a Chinese art historian and taught Chinese art history and even Japanese art history, about which I knew less than Chinese, or at least I wasn't as trained. And I want to introduce you to kimono to begin with, and then I'll tell you a little about myself. So here are two examples of kimono, one of the most miraculous garments in the world. Because number one, everyone in Japan wears kimono from birth to death, at least in the olden day. Children, old men, young men, and they all wear the same shaped clothes. They're rectangles, 2 long rectangles and 2 short rectangles, sleeves and body, and then a few leftovers twisted into a, am I screen sharing? Okay. 2 leftovers are twisted into a collar. I don't have a picture of the front of a kimono, but The textile tradition of Japan is like none other in the world, and that is why I came to it. It partakes of the most extraordinary decorative tradition anywhere. The craftsmanship is unmatched. The fabrics are as varied as any in the world. They're not particularly tribal. They're not ethnographic in the sense of Indonesia or Africa or India. And each kimono is different from the next one, which is what is exciting to someone like me. So I came to Japan first as an art historian with my professor from Berkeley, James Cahill, tagging along on an art viewing trip in 1969. We spent all our time looking at great art. We went to the best dealers, we went to the best museums, we went to the best exhibitions, and we never looked at kimono. That was a craft. We were interested in Chinese paintings in Japan, Japanese paintings in Japan, lacquer, everything except kimono. It wasn't a particular, I mean, we didn't leave it out on purpose, but it wasn't really part of my training or part of my education. I was in Japan for 2 weeks, having a wonderful time for the first time. It was 51 years ago, before you were all born, probably. And I was enthralled with Japan, but I was on my way to Taiwan to learn more about Chinese paintings, which I did. And I was eager to come back to Japan, so I picked a dissertation topic, which was about a Chinese painter very admired in Japan, namely Xiaogui. So I went back to Japan in 1972, 3 years later, with a $2,200 fellowship for 1 year. And I wanted to acquire, let's see. I thought I would, because of my knowledge had increased, I thought I would find a sotatsu or maybe a korin at the flea market. So I went to the flea market looking for great Japanese lacquers and ceramics, and I didn't find, well, I found some things, but I didn't find my korin or my sotatsu. And with $2,200, it would have had to have been an accident to acquire such a thing. So I found, however, piles and piles of old clothes. Well, old clothes in Japan are quite different from old clothes in America or in any other culture because, number one, if you look carefully and you choose carefully, and there are millions of kimono, 999,999 of them are really not beautiful. But every once in a while, you find one that's really special. The one on the left here, for example, is a double ikat silk of the most complex mechanical issue, as you can imagine. And the one on the right is just plays the typical Japanese game of checkerboards with other forms on top. So it's a double checkerboard, it's a grid, it's got dots. It has all kinds of modern appeal. These are not kimono to be taken apart. These are kimono to cherish as such. And in fact, the one on the left has just been sold to LA County Museum, I'm happy to say. And the one on the right could be yours. Call me. In 1972, there I was in Japan, and I went to the flea markets every once in a while with a few dollars, and I bought a few kimono just to decorate my apartment, and a few tenagui towels and a few yukata, just something to make my surroundings aesthetically pleasing, that the surroundings were rather spare. And 4 years later, having come back from Japan, having taught at University of Denver, having immersed myself in the academic life, I decided, I don't think so. I don't want to be an academic. I would rather acquire things and educate people by showing them what I think is good and true and beautiful. So I started a company called Asiatica, thinking that the name would be self-explanatory. Well, it used to be, but to modern generations, it's completely unintelligible what this word means. So here's Asiatica, a true establishment, a 6,000 square foot building in 1 block into Kansas from the city of Kansas City. Here's the interior. As you can see, Asiatica has expanded beyond, well, actually, it's still doing what it always did, namely acquiring Japanese and Chinese functional objects. But what really has become the tail wagging the dog, so to speak, is kimono. We sell, as you can see, furniture, and we still have the white brass stools that we had made in Hong Kong 45 years ago. The last two I will not sell. They make nice holes in the carpet. And at the back of the picture, you'll see some clothing. So now back to kimono. So what's so great about kimono? I already said it's the modular construction. It's the infinite variety of patterns. And it's a hunt that I go on every year. This is the first year in many years that I haven't been going to Japan in the month of June to go on my kimono hunt. And on the left, you see last year, this is probably the product of about 10 days, well, not even 10 days, 5 days shopping in Kyoto, everywhere I can possibly go to pick out the cherries from the pie. And then I come back to my hotel and I make a nice arrangement on the couch and count and fold and admire and think and sort. And on the right is a picture of the room that I'm actually standing in, which is the room of leftovers. We have acquired many, many, many kimono over the years. It all began with me realizing that the most desirable product that I had to sell at Asiatica was not Chinese furniture, was not Japanese prints, was not ceramics, was not baskets, was clothing. People love to buy clothes and they buy them repeatedly. So with my business partner at the time, Fifi White, whom I acquired Fifi because of her knowledge of textiles, so to speak. Didn't acquire Fifi, but I got Fifi to be part of the team. And together we started to buy kimono with a view to making Western clothes out of them, because we wanted to buy kimono. And you had to figure out, why should you buy kimono? Western people don't really buy kimono to wear. At least they shouldn't, I don't think. They don't look particularly attractive. Should we make pillows? No, I don't think so, although we're almost at the pillow point at this juncture. We just wanted to buy beautiful textiles, and the most logical thing to do was to make Western clothes from Japanese textiles. We didn't want them to look ethnographic. We didn't want people to come up and say, oh, you've been to Japan, how smart of you. We just wanted our customers to find compliments and pleasure in wearing beautiful clothes. And this was a perfect way to make each garment totally different from the next, different shapes, different fabrics, different sizes. We know a lot about kimono as far as the seasonal references and the kinds of fabrics, linens, silks, cottons, ikat, tie-dye, printed textiles, etc. But our main focus was just aesthetic. They had to be in good condition and we had to like them, because if they were not attractive in Japan, they would not get any more attractive when we brought them back to Kansas City. So here's our scrap room. This means that each of these pieces of fabric, organized by color and technique, these top rows are all shibori or tie-dye, just by accident. Each of these rolls has been cut once. So there are leftovers. And it's also fabulous material for an archive of 20th century Japanese textiles, because most people do not collect their own textiles. So anyway, they don't collect the textiles of secondhand clothes of their own time. But we've been doing this for over 50 years. The collection, as Fifi and I would go to Japan, she retired 20 years ago, but we used to go together every year with voracious appetite. And Fifi was collecting Japanese folk textiles. By the way, the exhibition catalog, which Tom showed, the exhibition was preceded at Suntory Museum by an exhibition at Japan Society in New York. So that folk textile collection was made into a fabulous exhibition which traveled to Japan and absolutely stunned the Japanese, because they thought, what? Who wants these things? This strange Westerner has been collecting our folk textiles, really? Well, anyway, that collection was Fifi's. I participated a little bit. We both oohed and awed over the things we could find. This other part of our search went to clothing, fabrics for clothing. And the third part went to this group, which is called the stash. The stash consists of things we haven't cut. We don't want to really cut them until we absolutely have to. And we like to open the doors to the stash cabinet regularly and admire our collecting. This little vignette is mostly linen kimono, because being in Japan in the summer, we've been seeing mostly linen. So these three-part collections, I still retain the stash, and I've been making a collection of Meisen kimono as well. So there are intact pieces. We're not criminally decimating the collection. Now, what do we do with the kimono? We make clothes. So let's start at the beginning. We bought this haori, which is a jacket that's worn like a kimono over a kimono. It happens to be made of Meisen, this rather stiff, doubly cut silk. And this is it as we bought it. This is it as we've washed. We take it apart, we wash it, we iron it. If it needs it, we smell it first. If it needs washing, we wash it. They're all, virtually all these fabrics are washable. And then we stretch it out on a cutting table and decide what we're going to make out of it. And once we've decided that, we lay the pattern on top. And the person who cuts the fabric has to be very careful to make sure that the design is laid out in some aesthetic point of view. This is another kind of clothing we make. The first one was made entirely from one haori. But as you can see behind me, there are all these scraps. So what should we do with those? Well, we can make our version. It's really not boro, it's patchwork. So on the left, you have some dark linen ikats, which come in the most extraordinary variety of geometric combinations. And here we've chosen a certain number of things that we think go together, along with a solid and a stripe. And on the right, you have some cotton leftovers, a stripe, a solid, broad stripe, ranging in indigo from very dark to very light. And both of these will become garments. And here's part of my team who have to figure all this out and make it work properly. A pattern maker, a cutter, and a sewer. And there are more involved than this, but these are invaluable people who make aesthetic decisions every day. And here are some finished clothes. As far as boro goes, our version of boro is really a patchwork, and we've invented several different ways to make patchwork. One way is to cut it up, cut the fabric, make a bundle of all different kinds of pieces that have some affinities, stitch them, stitch the pieces to silk in parallel stitches on the bias, sew them back together again, wash them. The whole technique is described very well on our website, which is Asiatica KC for Kansas City. You can read all about it and how we do it. On the left, obviously it's blue, and on the right are a whole series of cocoa colored pieces, two different styles, and you can see that neither of these will ever be repeated. Another version of our boro or use of scrap, on the left, Alice, one of our precious employees, has stitched small ikat indigos to denim and made a grid on top of a piece of denim. And on the right, again, another version of blues put together. And this has nothing to do with patchwork. These are two examples of tie-dyed fabrics from which we made two completely different garments and two completely different looking fabrics. So the variety is infinite, and every day is fun to come to work and see what we've come up with next. And now we get to the final project, which is a minor project at Asiatica, but it's a major version of boro. So we have some among other scraps, we have what's behind me in this room, but we also have what we call the chicken boxes, which are a whole stack of waxed cardboard cartons filled with little pieces like you see on the left. This is a box filled with blue cotton indigos from Japan. And what should we make out of this? So the brilliant idea came up. Kate decided she was going to make a big ottoman, making a patchwork out of all kinds of blue and fabrics, little ones, square ones, etc. And that's the beginning on the right. And here it's laid out, and it's not easy to make a patchwork. You have to make many aesthetic decisions. It's distribution of light and dark, small and large patterns, etc. And what she's decided to do to pull it all together is to lay some strips of indigo on top and tie it all together. And the shape becomes this, which is a big, huge ottoman. And sitting on the ottoman is a model wearing a dress made of an antique kimono. And here's the finished ottoman, probably the least practical thing we've ever made, and very beautiful. So the reason that we make clothes is because how many people would like to buy a large ottoman that's very comfortable, that's sitting in Kansas City? We hope somebody, and we're going to make some smaller versions. And this is as close to boro as we actually come. The rest of our project in general is totally sustainable. The clothes are worn for years and years, and the fabrics are almost unrecognizable. Many of our customers have no idea that they're even Japanese, and it doesn't really matter to them. They just want to look good, and we want them to. And we've been doing this for many years, and we hope to do it for many more. And I really look forward to going to Japan and hunting again everywhere I can for more. There's never enough kimono for me. Thank you very much, and thank you to JASA and to the Japan Society and to my fellow panelists for giving me a platform to tell you what we do. And now I guess it's Monica's turn. Right?
Yes.
And I should stop share if I could figure out how to do it. I think I do escape.
Thank you so much for this wonderful presentation, and I really enjoyed, and it was really inspiring to hear two different angles about collecting and studying kimono and creating new items out of secondhand kimono. So with this, I would like to invite Tom and Elizabeth to join me for a panel discussion. And I would like to have a few questions for both of them. To begin, what does the beauty of practicality, which is in Japanese yuyo no bi, and the concept of no waste mean to you? Maybe Tom could start.
Well, I will, because I have the personal experience of when I was a little boy at Christmas time, my uncle would bring back presents from Japan. And these little toys were actually made out of recycled orange juice cans. And, you know, we looked at these things with wonder because everything was used. And I really admire that because it's a constant opportunity for inventiveness. And originally, you know, that extends because there wasn't the wealth of a surplus. And I think that it applies in my own personal life. I just want to mention that being the child of parents who made it through the Depression, which was unfortunately a bit of a timely subject now, but they never believed in wasting anything. So for me, the idea of the beauty in recycling as both philosophically, ecologically, and very much attuned in a greater sense to the Japanese aesthetic of living with nature in an effective manner. So I hesitate to express too far, as I can't claim to be an expert on just about anything, but I appreciate the opportunity to be asked.
Thank you. What about you, Elizabeth? What do you think of the yuyo no bi, the
We don't waste
beauty of practicality?
We waste nothing at Asiatica. The scrap room has the larger pieces. The alpha baskets has the next size pieces. The chicken boxes has the smallest pieces. And we have a friend in Kansas City who makes woven fabrics out of the smallest scraps. So nothing is wasted. And every time that somebody even wants to make a jewelry bag out of a little piece of fabric, I think, well, I don't know, maybe we could use that as part of it. So this room shows you nothing goes to waste. And I mean, I'm an old lady. In my generation, nobody wasted anything. We kept retying the shoelaces. We reused plastic bags. I don't come from a wasteful environment. And so it's totally natural to me to be practical. Every last bit of the toothpaste tube is emptied. I swear I could cut it open with a knife and make sure there's nothing left inside. And I feel the same way about these textiles. We have even a category here called rotten but of interest. That is, if we bought a kimono or a haori or something that is just rotten, we cannot use it. It's been wet, or it's just about to fall apart. We can't use it for clothing. Then we put it in the category rotten but of interest, because it has a wonderful pattern. So if anyone wants to come and go through our leftovers and make something of them, please, we're available.
Now that sounds wonderful. To continue the conversation with a different aspect of what we discussed, in contemporary fashion, the recycling and the boro idea was picked up by international labels such as the Comme des Garçons or Yohji Yamamoto. And boro, again, when I attended the opening of the Japan Society's exhibition, I saw many young people. So what do you think? What is the attraction of boro to designers and the younger generation? Elizabeth.
I think there are several things that are attractive. Have you all read the book Bobos in Paradise? Well, if you haven't, it's worth reading. And it points out that the contemporary people who are aspirational today are not aspiring for gilding and marble and velvet, but they aspire to have worn barnwood, distressed stones for their environments. And I think it has to do with the fact that we're very spoiled and everything polished doesn't look man-made or handmade. And the whole idea, I mean, I abhor the idea of ripped blue jeans. If you have ripped your blue jeans because you've worked so hard with them, then you're ready for some boro. But if you're wearing ripped blue jeans to show how fashionable you are, I think it's a message that I find a little bit distasteful. That's not the same as what Comme des Garçons or Yohji or Christina does with bits and pieces to make something beautiful out of leftovers. It's quite a different aesthetic. And the two aesthetics, I think, are quite parallel, but different. And what we do is, again, it's partly a rescue project, because you see, in the beginning, I saw these kimono going to waste. The Japanese rejected them as having too many associations with their own culture. I don't really care if I use a man's kimono or with a child's kimono fabric. I understand the meaning of those fabrics, but I don't need to observe them. So I'm free to pick and choose from their leftovers to make my fresh product. I don't consider it to be distressed.
Right.
Even
though it
though
also ties together with the no waste idea that we started the discussion with. Tom, what do you think about the jeans? We had a brief
discussion. Well, I appreciate hearing Elizabeth's perspective, because it always seemed odd to me that you have to pay extra for ripped up jeans. Now, it's like, but being actually of the hippie generation, I have to say that, we prided ourselves as being unique individuals, even though it turned out that we were all wearing the same kind of worn out clothes, and including worn out indigo blue jeans. Perhaps that is one of the bases of my aesthetic affinity for boro, because the blue jeans that I wore and continue to wear goes back to indigo. But I'd like to just put in a second there about some of these leading Japanese artists of fashion, I admire them, first of all, because their textile art is truly beautiful. And it's something which I can recognize. And I recognized that when I was living in Japan. I was thinking, you know, to me, Italian and Japanese sense of fashion are extremely first rate. And I noticed that some of these great artists were drawing resources from Indian textiles, and some of the great collections of Indian textiles are now in Japan, have been in Japan, and that their appreciation for Indonesian, so that they, and South American, pre-Columbian textiles, Andean textiles, African textiles. So this is a melting pot in Japan, and that Boro is actually part of a bigger picture. And so I think that rather than necessarily pigeonholing that some of these costume, marvelous dresses, etc., were directly inspired by Boro per se, there are, just a quick reminder that India, for example, has also patchwork traditions and that were collected in Japan, and that there are museums, both private and public, that collect those textiles in Japan. So I admire the universality of the appreciation of textiles by the Japanese, and it was what first brought me to Japan in the first place. But I close with that.
Thank you,
Back to
Tom.
you.
I have a few questions for Tom, and he sent me slides. So I'm going to share my screen again while talking to Tom. So we mentioned Tanaka Chusaburo, who collected most of the Boro on view at the Japan Society's exhibition. How the Boro fits into the collecting activities of Tanaka, who collected not only textiles, but baskets, boxes, all kinds of artifacts. And he documented the lifestyle of people in Aomori. He was also himself from Aomori. So what do you think of his collecting and collection?
Well, I greatly admire his work, and I wish that that we share with each other, that you can know you can know the person by their taste. And his commitment to the people and culture from where he came, which was the most northern part, and the awareness, just as many people in Japan were tossing out all old things, which is part of their custom in general, that the society of the folk traditions of the farmers and fishermen of the far north ceramics, clocks. I mean, this man collected everything, 30,000 pieces. Now, me, I have a modest collection of only 2,000 Indonesian textiles. But I studied anthropology. I believe in the value of material culture to document a lifestyle or a cultural heritage, which is passing owing to modern assimilation. And so his window on the culture of the far north and the rather harsh life that people had to live, I mean, he has tremendous respect. And I respect as well Kurosawa for going to him for authenticity in his filming. So the recognition that these were honest pieces. So his choices were, and perhaps not, in some cases, they were very beautiful, but his primary as an anthropologist to document all aspects of the culture.
Right. One special group of the Boro fabrics are called Bodo or Bodoko mats. And I think it would be very interesting for our audience if you could say a few words about the anthropological significance of the Bodo.
Well, thank you. I mean, this is a marvelous idea, and this is within traditional societies, this is a metaphor that happens to be expressed here, but it is not exclusively here because I'm familiar with the principle in Indonesia as well. And so the great moments of life, whether we're talking about birth, puberty, marriage, attaining a rank in society, and death, funerals, these are all marked by moments. In the case of the far north, this kind of textile, which has this layering, accompanies the childbirth, would be the mat upon which a woman would give birth. And you'll note that this layering of maybe we could say the great-grandmothers and the grandmothers and the mother's cloth layering there, we are seeing an almost genealogical diagram. And there was I would call it a prayer that I've copied here from a caption at the Amuse Museum, which is there for you to read, but it's a recognition of the nature of life itself is captured in the beauty and wonder of these seeming rags. And yet it's an homage, and for lack of a better word, even a spiritual reference to nature, the nature of the life cycles of birth and death.
Yes, wonderful. And finally, just a few words about the Ainu tradition, because in Ainu culture, they also recycle and reuse fragments of textiles. So maybe just one or two sentences about to compare with Aomori.
Well, I really appreciated Monica's map showing the trade route of the bringing up of cloth. And actually, the ship stops in Hokkaido, and the fragments that would be taken off there would not only go to the north of Honshu, but also be incorporated into the Ainu costumes, which I love. And I just put in the plug for Ainu because it's very dear to my heart. Not only do we see a progression from more traditional bast fibers, but with the arrival of cotton, the use of cotton as created an opportunity for an efflorescence of Ainu design. But also, not only are we seeing these marvelous graphic patterns, but you'll see use of kimono and exotic silks as linings and so forth, which added prestige in their society of something remote and fascinating for them. And so I just think this is part of the bigger picture about repurposing of cloth, and lends itself actually to what Elizabeth has been talking about.
Thank you so much, Tom. And it's the wonderful timing to pass it on to Elizabeth. And,
Monica, now there so many questions from the audience, and the time is almost 6:15. Don't you mind to move to a little bit to the audience Q&A? They really wanted to hear the speaker's question.
For example, there is a question to Elizabeth. What did James Cahill think of your endeavor? Did he want you to continue in Chinese art?
Well, I'm his oldest living graduate student with no PhD. As I said, I went to Japan in 1972 I missed the part, my reason for going to Japan, and my fellowship was to write my dissertation. Well, I got very discouraged by the Japanese scholars with whom I was supposed to work, so I never did my dissertation. I think he was disappointed that such a promising scholar turned into a merchant. But I was not. I was happy to learn whatever he had to teach me, and it was invaluable, but I didn't want to be an academic, thank you very much. And I'm so happy that I've been doing what I love to do for the last 45 years with a grounding in his superb training.
Another question from the audience. When did boro begin to be appreciated in Japanese culture? And is there any other patchwork beyond Boro in Japanese culture?
Well, as far as I'm concerned, there was a man called Sasaki who lived in Osaka. And one day, I think he turned to the backs of these Tsutsugaaki futon that we were all collecting and found that the backs, which everybody was sort of poo-pooing or discarding, had these wonderful indigo patchworks, inadvertent, I mean, done with no particular aesthetic purpose. And he photographed them and they all looked like Diebenkorns. And he published a book, and then everyone, including me, went crazy and thought, ooh, I want some of those. But in my whole collecting career, I personally have only owned 4 Boro, because in many cases they make me very sad. I think it's at their truest function, they express poverty and necessity and desperation, really. And as aesthetic objects, if the person who made the patchwork had aesthetic sensibilities, that was great. And in fact, many under kimono are made of patches, and they're very, very beautiful. And I've collected several of those, and Morita had a wonderful collection of chirimen and various other silks put together in beautiful ways to wear underneath your kimono.
Right. And 2 very quick questions again for Elizabeth. What kind of material do you feel the Ottoman did? And is the double ikat still being woven in Japan?
Well, Meisen ikat, I didn't mention that Nuno and Reiko Sudo is our secondary source of fabrics from Japan. So we find a perfect combination between pattern from old kimono, textures from Nuno, and Reiko at one point found somebody who still knew how to make Meisen, which was really stopped being made at the end of the 50s. And she made a few Meisen designs and had them made, but I think the person who taught her has passed away. And the last conversation we had was that complex doubly cut tradition is gone. The ottoman, to go back to that, is stuffed with beanbag beans, styrofoam little beans that you can pour carefully from a big plastic bag that you get from Uline. And we made an inner ottoman out of muslin with a zipper. And we filled that with the beanbag beans. And then we put that whole thing inside the other ottoman with also a zipper so it can be washed.
Well, thank you so much. Thank you so much for the presentations and the very exciting conversation we had. I think we are running out of time. So I think it's a good moment to close this wonderful panel discussion. And thank you again to the organizers, the panelists, and everybody who attended this webinar. And I do hope that we can meet in person soon again. Thank you so much. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Monica. I'd like to say thank you on behalf of this event and at the Japan Society. And yes, it's a wonderful discussion. And Dr. Monica Vincek described the Japan Society exhibition more than us. And it's such a wonderful to hear all the kind of theoretical and academic presentation. And Mr. Tom Murray, you came to the Japan Society the last day of the show, before it's closed. It was really great honor. You really get excited about the installation, such an encouraging for us. And Miss Elizabeth Wilson, you may keep giving the life to the Bolon and textile of Japanese art. And I can tell you, it's half of the lady of the opening wearing Asiatica. So it was really the moment. So it was really great to hear all the, your discussion. And thank you very much. And I also especially wanted to thank you all the JASA committee who make this event happen. Amy Pastor, Alison Tolman, Victoria Mendeles, and also Japan Society staff, the Kao, Elizabeth, Amy Manica, and Tiffany Lambert, and also technically Aki and Ben Wallen. All of them is work hard behind the scene of this kind of virtual platform and make things happen. And one good news is the Japan Society Boro extend the exhibition until July 19th. Still, we don't know we can open the door of the exhibition, but we are waiting. So once it's opened the door, everybody welcome to go back to Japan Society. So thank you very much, everybody, and stay safe and be well. Thank you.